Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. Every night, a soft knocking comes at the door, quiet, deliberate, and unyielding. It's a strange rhythm that lingers in the silence, unsettling and mysterious. When a man finally dares to invite the unseen visitor inside, everything changes. The knocking doesn't stop. It only deepens the chilling question: what happens when you open the door to something that should have stayed outside? Tonight, we'll uncover a story of a presence that waits patiently for permission, a presence that crosses the threshold only when invited. What lies beyond that knocking? Is it a prank, a ghost, or something far darker? Stay with us as we explore the terrifying truth behind the words no one should ever say aloud. Come in. Every night, without fail, the knocking began. It started as a soft, distant sound, barely louder than a whisper against the front door. At first it was easy to ignore, a fleeting annoyance among the familiar creaks and sighs of an old apartment. It wasn't just noise. It had a rhythm, a steady, deliberate tap, tap, tap that cut through the silence with unsettling persistence. The first night, curiosity won over caution. He opened the door quickly, expecting a neighbor or some prankster to be standing there, maybe holding a forgotten package or asking for directions. But the porch was empty. The street lamp flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. No one, just the echo of footsteps fading into the dark. He shut the door and laughed nervously, chalking it up to a prank. But as the nights passed, the knocking continued. The same rhythm, the same steady tapping, always at the same time. It became a presence, a message he couldn't decode. Days blurred into nights, and the knocking grew louder in his mind than in the real world. He tried to distract himself with work, music, and late-night television. But every silence between songs, every moment of quiet, brought the knock back to his ears. It was as if the sound was waiting, patient, deliberate, not angry, not desperate, just waiting for an invitation. No matter how tightly he locked the door, or how many times he checked the windows, the knocking came, always at the same time, always the same rhythm. It became a fixture in his life, something he dreaded, but also strangely needed to hear. He told himself it was harmless, maybe a neighbor's lost child, or an animal trapped outside. But the emptiness beyond the door suggested otherwise. There was no explanation that made sense. One evening, tired of the torment, he spoke to the silence. "If you're there, then come in," he said softly, half joking, half challenging the unseen visitor to cross the threshold. The knocking stopped immediately. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath. He stood frozen, his heart racing, unsure if he had just sealed a deal he didn't understand. The quiet was thicker than any noise had been before. No footsteps, no whisper, no movement, just the overwhelming sensation that something had changed. He locked the door again, more out of habit than security, but the weight in the room didn't lift. He wondered if the knocking was never a warning, but a test. And now that he had invited it, the rules had shifted. That night, sleep eluded him. The silence was unbearable, pressing in from every corner of the small apartment. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak felt like a breath held too long. His mind raced with questions. What had he invited in? What lived beyond that door in the darkness? He thought about the stories he'd heard growing up, about spirits and presences that waited patiently, only entering when given permission. He'd always dismissed them as myths, but now, alone in the dark, the stories felt painfully real. The knocking was not just a sound. It was a presence, and it waited for permission to cross the line between outside and inside. He had given it that permission, even if just in a moment of frustration or jest. And now, the silence held a promise he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. Morning light came slowly, as if reluctant to expose the remnants of the night's terror. The sun poured through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. Yet the unease lingered. The door was still locked, the windows shut tight, but the apartment felt different. There was a heaviness, a lingering chill that no sunlight could chase away. He tried to shake the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination running wild. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The knocking had stopped, yes, but the fear that had grown with it was now rooted deep inside him. It was a seed that would not be uprooted. He wondered how long the silence would last before the knocking returned, and what would happen if he heard it again. Would he dare say those words once more? As the days stretched on, the silence grew suffocating. The absence of the knocking was not relief. It was a void filled with anticipation and dread. He found himself glancing toward the door whenever the clock ticked closer to midnight. The world outside continued as usual, neighbors going about their lives, children playing, cars passing on the street, unaware of the darkness waiting just beyond the threshold. He envied their ignorance. Each night, he wondered if the knocking would start again, if the sound would pierce the silence and remind him of the presence lingering outside. He tried to stay busy, filling his hours with tasks and distractions, but the fear clung to him like a shadow. The waiting was worse than the knocking itself. Then, without warning, the knocking returned. But this time, it felt different, closer, more urgent. It echoed through the apartment, reverberating in his bones. He stood frozen, the words, "Come in," trapped on his lips. The door didn't open, but the air shifted. The boundary between inside and out seemed thinner, fragile. He reached for the lock, fingers trembling, but the knocking continued, steady and unrelenting. It was no longer a simple sound. It was a summons, a message from something beyond the veil of his understanding. The night stretched on, and he waited, waiting to see if the visitor would take the invitation, or if the silence would claim him once again.
The knocking that night was different, not in pattern but in feeling. It was no longer distant or hesitant. It was deliberate and close, echoing through the small apartment like a slow, steady heartbeat. He could feel it more than hear it, vibrating through the floorboards, pressing against the walls. The sound wasn't angry or demanding. It was patient, cold, and expectant, as if it was waiting for something. He wanted to believe it was a trick of the mind, the product of too many sleepless nights and growing anxiety, but deep inside, he knew this was something else entirely, something not meant for the daylight,
something that could only thrive in silence and shadow. The knocking wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, and it was waiting for his permission. His thoughts spiraled into fear and curiosity, wrestling for control. What if it wasn't a visitor he could see or touch? What if it was something far older, something that had waited for years in the darkness, bound by some unseen rule? He remembered the stories whispered in childhood, the warnings about opening doors to things you don't understand. And yet, the words he had spoken, half in jest, echoed back to him like a curse. Come in. That invitation, careless and flippant, was now a weight he carried everywhere. It was as if those words had broken an invisible barrier, an agreement that now tethered him to the knocking and to whatever was on the other side. He wanted to tell someone, to confess what was happening, but how could he? How do you explain knocking with no one there? How do you explain fear without a face? The loneliness of the experience pressed down on him. Friends would laugh it off, or worse, think he was losing his mind. He felt isolated, trapped inside his own house, with a presence that had no name, no face, but all the power. Every night, he waited, dread mixing with a strange, twisted hope. Hope that the knocking would stop, and dread that it never would. The uncertainty clawed at him, sharper and more relentless than the sound itself. One night, the knocking paused for longer than usual, and he thought maybe it was over. Relief washed over him like a wave, light and freeing. But then, just as sleep was about to claim him, a new sound joined the knocking, a faint whisper, barely audible, almost drowned by the silence. It wasn't words he could understand, more like a breath, a sigh carried on the night air. The sound was close, too close, and it sent a chill straight through him. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the mind playing games with the dark. But the whisper was there again, a low, haunting presence that felt like it was speaking directly to him, calling him deeper into the unknown. He began to notice changes around the apartment. Small things at first, objects slightly out of place, cold spots in rooms where the air should have been warm, shadows that didn't belong. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, just subtle signs that he wasn't alone. He questioned his own memory, doubted his senses. Was the knocking changing him? Or was something else creeping in, using the silence and darkness to break through? The fear that once came with the knocking began to morph into something heavier, an almost tangible presence, pressing against his skin and whispering secrets he could not hear. He found himself watching the door more than the TV, listening for sounds in empty rooms. His nights became a battle between exhaustion and terror. The knocking came every night, never varying in rhythm but growing in intensity. Sometimes it felt like a pulse, a heartbeat trying to sync with his own. Other times it was sharp and sudden, demanding attention. The presence outside waited patiently, but its patience felt endless, like a trap closing in slowly, inexorably. He resisted the urge to speak again, to invite it in, but the memory of those words haunted him, like a warning he ignored too long. Come in. The phrase looped endlessly in his mind, a mantra he both feared and couldn't forget. He was caught between wanting to reject the visitor and fearing what might happen if he did. Sleep was no longer a refuge but a place of vulnerability. He dreamed of the knocking, sometimes distant, sometimes deafening, echoing in empty halls with no end. He saw shadows moving at the edges of vision, shapes that vanished when looked at directly. He woke with a start, heart pounding, feeling watched and exposed. Daylight offered no comfort. The fear stayed with him like a second skin. He wondered if the knocking was a test, a challenge, or a punishment. He wondered what lay beyond the door if he dared open it. The knocking was no longer just sound. It was an invitation and a warning. The nights grew heavier. The knocking was no longer just a sound outside the door. It felt like a pulse embedded deep within his chest, sinking with his breath, entwined with his heartbeat. He stopped trying to rationalize it. He stopped hoping it was a prank or a trick of the mind. The knocking had become a constant companion, a reminder that something beyond comprehension was waiting just outside, invisible yet undeniably present. The patience in the rhythm was maddening, as if whatever was there was measuring his resolve, testing his fear, waiting for him to break. He began to notice the changes inside himself as well. The anxiety clung to him, but so did a strange sense of inevitability, as if the knocking was a part of his existence now. Sleep came in fits and starts, and during the few hours he managed to rest, his dreams were haunted by the sound. The knocking echoed through labyrinths of shadow and light, calling him deeper into places he did not want to go, but could not resist. He woke often, drenched in sweat, heart racing, feeling eyes upon him even when alone. Daylight offered no reprieve. The feeling lingered like a shroud, tightening around his thoughts. One evening, after days of mounting dread, he found himself sitting alone in the dim glow of his living room. The clock ticked toward midnight, and the knocking began exactly on time, soft, deliberate, patient. But this time, something was different. It was as if the sound carried a new weight, a quiet urgency beneath its calm surface. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The words he had once joked, "Come in," hovered at the edge of his mind, taunting him. He resisted the impulse to speak them aloud. Instead, he reached for the door, fingers trembling as they brushed the cold wood. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and suffocating. The sudden stillness was worse than the noise. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the locked door. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper slipped through the silence. It wasn't a word, not a sentence, but a breath, soft, close, like someone exhaling just beyond the barrier. He froze, every muscle tense, unable to move or speak. The whisper faded as quickly as it came, leaving behind a silence that was even more unsettling. He wondered if the visitor was testing him, edging closer, but never crossing the line unless invited. The thought chilled him deeper than the cold air in the room. Over the following days, the presence became more tangible. Objects shifted slightly when he wasn't looking. Books moved a fraction of an inch, chairs not quite where he'd left them. Cold spots appeared in unexpected places, sudden drops in temperature that left him shivering, even when the heater hummed quietly. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of his vision, but whenever he looked directly, nothing was there. His senses became hyper-aware. Every creak, every sigh of the house, magnified into potential threats. He questioned his own mind, fearing he was losing grip on reality, but the signs were there. Something was in his home, waiting patiently for its chance. The knocking persisted nightly, its steady rhythm relentless. Some nights, it was faint, barely audible. Others it was loud and insistent, as if demanding entry. He tried everything, changing the locks, placing chairs against the door, even leaving lights on all night, but nothing stopped. It was as if the sound wasn't coming from outside at all, but from within the walls, a message sent through the very fabric of his home. The weight of it pressed down on him, draining his energy, clouding his thoughts. He found himself slipping into a constant state of vigilance, unable to relax or let down his guard. Despite the fear, a part of him felt drawn to the knocking, a twisted curiosity that gnawed at his resolve. What was waiting beyond the door? Was it real? Was it something that could be reasoned with? Or was it a force beyond understanding? The questions haunted him day and night, pulling him deeper into obsession. He became a prisoner in his own home, trapped between the world he knew and the darkness lurking just beyond his threshold. The knocking was no longer just sound. It was a summons, an invitation, and a warning all at once, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could resist. The night stretched longer, heavier, as the knocking persisted like a shadow refusing to be dismissed. Each knock seemed to carry weight beyond sound, a reminder that some doors once touched cannot be left closed. He found himself caught in a cruel waiting game. Each evening braced for the sound, every moment before midnight filled with a growing dread. It wasn't just the knocking anymore. It was the silence that followed, thick and expectant. The quiet that fell after the last tap was more terrifying than the noise itself. It pressed down on him, filling the room with a presence he couldn't name, but could feel in every bone. He began to speak less and less about it. Friends noticed the change, the tired eyes, the tight jaw, the nervous glances toward the door, but no one knew what to say. How do you explain a knocking that has no source? How do you tell someone the fear isn't of a person, but of an empty space waiting to be filled? He kept the secret to himself, locked behind walls stronger than any door. The knocking was his alone, a private terror that he couldn't share without losing himself. And so he waited, waiting for a sound that might never truly leave, waiting for something that might never come. One night, the knocking stopped entirely. The absence of the sound should have brought relief, but instead, it felt like a breath held too long. The silence was a living thing, pressing against his skin, making his skin crawl. He stood by the door, heart hammering, waiting for a sign. The minutes stretched into hours, and still, nothing. No knock, no whisper, no breath. The stillness was unbearable. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to break the silence. And in that suffocating quiet, he realized the knocking was not just a visitor, it was a warning. A warning of what happens when you invite the unknown inside. That night, sleep abandoned him completely. He sat in the dark, eyes wide open, listening for the faintest hint of the tapping. The door remained shut, locked tight, but the fear lingered like a shadow behind every thought. The silence was an invitation all its own, an empty space where something could enter without knocking. He remembered his words, the careless invitation he'd whispered in desperation. "Come in." Those words echoed in his mind, a summons that could not be taken back. He feared what might happen if he spoke them again. What had he really invited through that door? Days passed with no knocking. The absence was a cruel trick, a pause before a storm. His world shrank to the four walls of his apartment, the locked door, and the silence that followed him everywhere. He avoided looking at the door, but he couldn't ignore the sensation of eyes watching from just beyond the threshold. He felt like a prisoner, trapped not by locks or chains, but by something unseen. The knocking had become a presence in his life, a shadow cast over every moment, a reminder that some invitations lead nowhere but deeper into darkness. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, the knocking returned. It was softer this time, more tentative, almost shy, but it was there, clear and unmistakable. He stood frozen, torn between dread and a strange, aching hope. Was this a chance to close the door forever, or a signal that the visitor was closer than ever? The knocking seemed to pulse with life, breathing in time with his own heartbeat. He hesitated, words stuck in his throat. "Come in," he whispered, barely audible. The knocking stopped, the door remained closed, and yet something had changed. In the silence that followed, he felt the boundary between outside and inside blur. The fear, the waiting, the knocking. It was no longer a game, it was a crossing, a threshold that once stepped over could never be undone. He realized that some doors aren't just openings or barriers, they are choices, and sometimes those choices come in the form of a knock at midnight. He sat alone in the dark, the weight of his invitation pressing down like a silent scream. The knocking only happens when he says, "Come in," and now he was beginning to understand what that truly meant. The night after the knocking stopped was heavier than any before. The silence felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on every corner of the apartment. He moved slowly, shadows clinging to him as if the darkness itself was alive, breathing just beyond his senses. The absence of sound did not bring relief, but intensified the dread that something unseen had crossed the line. His heart hammered every time he glanced toward the front door, now a looming reminder that boundaries once thought secure might have already been broken. The cold that settled deep into his bones was a silent messenger, warning him that the knocking's absence was not peace, but a calm before an unknown storm. When he finally dared to approach the door in the dead of night, he found it wide open, not ajar or cracked, but fully unlocked and standing open to the chill night air. Panic flooded him as the impossible settled in. He was sure he had locked it, felt the weight of the keys in his pocket. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no disturbance in the quiet street. Yet the door invited the darkness inside, like a silent accomplice. The thought clawed at his mind. Had the visitor waited patiently, slipping inside without knocking, because the invitation had been given? The silence seemed to mock him, louder than any sound, whispering a truth too terrible to admit. Inside, the apartment looked unchanged, but the air was thick with tension. His eyes were drawn to the bed, where the sheets were disturbed, pressed down in the shape of a body recently left. The pillow held an imprint that was unmistakably not his, a lingering trace that screamed presence. A shiver ran through him as the realization settled. Something or someone had crossed the threshold, had taken refuge in his home, had claimed his bed. No knock, no warning, just silent invasion. His breath caught, and he reached out hesitantly, fingertips brushing the cold fabric. It was a haunting message, a visitor who no longer waited, but entered. Questions swirled through his mind, unanswered and relentless. Who had come through the door? What had he invited with his careless words? The visitor had mocked his skepticism, turned his joke into reality, and breached his sanctuary without a sound. He felt small, vulnerable, stripped of the safety that the locked door once symbolized. The presence was no longer an outside threat, but a shadow inside his walls, breathing with him, watching silently. The line that separated the visitor and himself had blurred beyond recognition. Now the silence between the knocks was filled with something darker, waiting in the stillness. The days that followed dissolved into a fog of fear and obsession. He checked the bed repeatedly, desperate for proof or explanation. The rumpled sheets became a cruel reminder of the invasion, an evidence of the visitor's claim. Each night, the knocking returned, but it no longer came from outside the door. It echoed through the apartment itself, through walls, floorboards, the very air he breathed. The visitor was no longer waiting for permission. It had crossed in silently and now stalked the rooms with quiet authority. Locked doors and bolted windows were useless, shields against an enemy that needed no physical barrier. His sleep was shattered, broken by dreams haunted with tapping and whispers. The knocking echoed in his mind, loud and insistent, blurring lines between waking and dreaming. Shadows danced just beyond his vision, fading whenever he tried to focus on them. He woke with a pounding heart and sweat-soaked sheets, eyes darting to empty corners. The visitor was not a distant noise, but a constant presence inside his home, inside his life. Fear twisted into paranoia as every sound, every movement became a threat. His world shrank until the apartment was a cage, and the knocking was the lock that kept him prisoner. Even in daylight, the weight of the visitor clung to him, an invisible leash pulling tight. He wondered if the knocking had ever been a test, an invitation that could be refused, ignored or defied. Now he realized the truth. The knocking only happens when he says, "Come in." But this time, he hadn't said it aloud, and yet the visitor had entered anyway. The rules had changed. The visitor was inside now, and the silence between the knocks was louder than ever. He was left wondering what came next, trapped between hope and terror, with a visitor who needed no invitation to stay. The presence inside his home shifted the very air he breathed. It wasn't just a visitor. It was an unseen weight pressing down on his mind, clouding his thoughts and twisting his reality. He found himself glancing constantly toward the door, heart racing with every creak or distant sound. The bed, once a place of rest, had become a monument to invasion. Each night he checked the sheets for new impressions, new signs of the visitor's silent occupation. The knock no longer needed to announce itself. Its absence was the message. The visitor had come and stayed, crossing the boundary he never thought would be broken. It was a presence that had no need to knock, because it already belonged there, inside the walls, inside his life. Time lost meaning, days blurred into nights, and the apartment transformed into a prison of silence and shadows. He grew restless, pacing the rooms with a nervous energy that no amount of distraction could quell. The visitor was there in the shifting shadows, in the cold drafts that came from nowhere, in the fleeting glimpses just beyond his vision. He could feel it watching, waiting for him to make the next move, to acknowledge the invisible guest that had claimed his space. The knocking had been a warning, a test, but the visitor had slipped inside silently, erasing the boundary between host and intruder. Sleep was a forgotten refuge. When he closed his eyes, the knocking returned in nightmares, louder and more urgent than ever before. It echoed through endless dark corridors, tapping on doors that led nowhere, calling his name in voices he couldn't understand. He woke gasping, drenched in cold sweat, the pounding of his heart drowning out the silence. The visitor had become a nightmare, made flesh, an unrelenting presence that refused to be ignored. Each breath in the dark apartment was a reminder that he was no longer alone, that the visitor had crossed the line and refused to leave. The fear transformed into obsession. He couldn't leave the apartment, yet he couldn't stay. The visitor haunted every moment, filling the silence with invisible footsteps, soft whispers, and the cold touch of unseen hands. He tried to reach out, to speak, but the visitor never answered. It was a presence that communicated in silence, in absence, in the lingering cold that followed him everywhere. The knocking only came when he gave permission, but now it was the silence that screamed. He lived in constant dread of the next sound, the next sign that the visitor was closer than ever. Despite the terror, There was a strange pull, a dark curiosity that rooted him to the apartment. He wanted to understand what had entered his life, to find a way to reclaim the boundary that had been broken. But the visitor was patient and powerful, slipping through cracks in reality that he could not mend. The knocking was a ritual, a code that no longer applied. The visitor had crossed the threshold without consent, and now held the key. He was trapped in a game he did not understand, with stakes higher than fear, stakes of identity, sanity, and survival. Every attempt to resist was met with silence that pressed against him like a physical force. The visitor was everywhere and nowhere, a shadow in the corners of the room, a breath on the back of his neck, a weight on his chest. The apartment was no longer a sanctuary, but a battleground between what was seen and unseen, known and unknown. He knew that the knocking was a boundary, a line that he could cross only once, and he had crossed it. Now the visitor was inside, and the silence between the knocks was louder than any sound he had ever heard. As days turned into weeks, he realized that the visitor's presence was a mirror, reflecting parts of himself he had long ignored. The knocking was no longer just a sound at the door. It was a call to confront the shadows within. But some shadows are not meant to be faced alone. The visitor was a reminder that some doors once opened cannot be closed, and sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones invited inside. He was left alone with the visitor, the silence and the knowledge that the knocking only happens when he says, "Come in." But what happens when the knocking stops and the visitor never leaves? The visitor's presence grew more insistent, though it remained unseen. It lingered in the stillness between sounds, in the spaces where light refused to reach. He felt its weight constantly, like a pressure pressing against his skin, a cold breath that never left his neck. The apartment, once a refuge, had become a place of silent terror. Every moment was charged with the threat of the unknown. His senses sharpened, eyes darting toward every shadow, ears straining to catch the faintest whisper. The knocking itself was no longer the signal. It was the visitor's waiting breath, a quiet demand that something inside him had changed. Fear gave way to a strange, uneasy fascination, as if the visitor was a part of him now, a reflection of a darkness he couldn't escape. Sleep became a battlefield. Dreams twisted into dark corridors where the knocking echoed endlessly, tapping on doors that led nowhere, and halls that stretched into infinity. In these nightmares he wandered alone, searching for an exit that never appeared. Sometimes the visitor appeared there, a shadowy figure just beyond reach, silent and watching. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, heart racing in the oppressive silence of his bedroom. The visitor did not stay in the realm of dreams alone. It haunted his waking hours, lingering in corners, slipping between the cracks of reality. He felt watched even in broad daylight, as if the visitor's gaze pierced through walls and time. His days were consumed by a desperate search for answers. He scoured books on the supernatural, read accounts of hauntings and possessions, anything that might explain the knocking and the silent visitor. But no story matched his experience. The visitor did not announce itself with terror or chaos. It was patient, quiet, almost respectful in its presence. It was a force that respected boundaries only to ignore them completely. The knocking was its ritual, a test of permission, but once inside it moved without rules. The visitor was no longer bound by the etiquette of the unseen. It was a silent conqueror, and he was its captive. Isolation deepened. He avoided friends and family, unable to explain the dread that enveloped him. His world shrank to the small, dark apartment where the visitor waited patiently. He spoke little, and when he did, His voice trembled with the weight of unspoken fears. The visitor fed on his loneliness, growing stronger in the silence. Each knock that no longer came was a reminder of the line crossed and the boundary lost. He realized that the visitor was not just a presence, but a part of his life now, inseparable and inevitable. The apartment was no longer just walls and furniture. It was a threshold between worlds, and he was trapped in the middle. The visitor's silence became a language he struggled to understand. It communicated not in words, but in the shifting shadows and cold drafts that surrounded him. Every night he listened for the knock that had once been the signal, but it was replaced by a deeper, more unsettling quiet. The visitor no longer needed to announce itself. It was already there, embedded in the fabric of his existence. The silence was no longer absence. It was presence, and with presence came power. He felt powerless to resist, caught in a web woven from his own invitation, a pact made in desperation and fear. Hope faded, replaced by resignation. The visitor had crossed the threshold without knocking, had claimed a place inside him and his home. He was no longer the master of his domain, but a guest in his own life. The knocking was a memory, a ghost of what had been, and the silence was the new reality. It was a reminder that some invitations cannot be revoked, some doors cannot be closed. The visitor was patient, unyielding, and eternal. He was left to wonder what would become of him, trapped in a silent war with a presence he could neither see nor fight. In the deepest hours of the night, when the world was still, he realized that the visitor was not just a stranger. It was a part of himself, a darkness invited in by his own voice, a shadow born of fear and loneliness. The knocking only happens when he says, "Come in." But the visitor stayed, long after the knocking ceased, filling the silence with a cold that would never leave. And as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, he understood the true horror. Some knocks are invitations, yes, but some silences are prisons. The days merged into a continuous haze, marked only by the relentless presence that filled his apartment. The visitor, once a distant knocking at the door, had become a silent companion that haunted every corner of his existence. He moved through his routines like a ghost, eyes shadowed by exhaustion and mind tangled in fear. The visitor was no longer outside, no longer waiting. It was inside, a part of the fabric of his life. It whispered in silence, lingered in the cold drafts that slipped through closed windows, and watched from spaces between the walls. He could not escape it. It was always there, a dark pulse beneath the surface of his reality. Each night, the absence of knocking was a reminder of the boundary broken, the invitation accepted. The silence became a voice in itself, cold, vast, and filled with a terrible promise. He no longer dared to speak aloud, fearing that any word might summon the visitor closer. The visitor had no need to announce itself anymore. It was already inside. It was a shadow on the edge of vision, a breath on his skin, a presence felt in every silent moment. His home, once a place of safety, had become a stage for a silent horror that no one else could see or understand. He was trapped, watching and waiting for a threat that would never declare itself. Isolation grew with every passing day. He withdrew further from friends and family, unable to explain the creeping dread that shadowed his steps. The visitor fed on his solitude, growing stronger in the dark spaces left behind by connection and hope. The knocking, once a question waiting for an answer, was now a distant memory, a warning forgotten in the face of the visitor's quiet domination. He longed for the sound, anything to break the oppressive silence, but the visitor had replaced it with something worse. a suffocating stillness that screamed louder than any knock. His thoughts became a battlefield where fear and reason fought for control. He questioned his sanity, wondering if the visitor was a product of his unraveling mind or a real presence that had crossed into his life. The line between reality and nightmare blurred until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The visitor's silence was a darkness that swallowed light and hope. It filled every space with cold certainty that some doors once opened change everything. He realized that the knocking was not just sound. It was a threshold, a choice, and now the visitor was inside, beyond reach and beyond fight. Despite the overwhelming fear, a part of him was drawn toward understanding. He sought out old texts, folklore, anything that might explain the visitor's nature and how to send it away. But every story ended the same way, with acceptance or defeat. The visitor was patient, waiting for surrender, feeding on the cracks in his will. He felt like a man caught in a tide, struggling against a current too strong to escape. The knocking had been an invitation, yes, but now the visitor was a presence that needed no further welcome, a shadow that could not be banished with words or locks. In the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, he found himself speaking softly to the visitor, asking questions into the dark. There was no answer, only the endless silence that pressed against him like a living thing. The visitor was patient, unyielding, eternal. It waited not for permission but for acceptance, and he feared the acceptance was already there, buried deep within his fear and loneliness. The knocking only happens when he says, "Come in," but the visitor's silence was the real invitation, a quiet that spoke of things beyond his understanding. As the first light of morning crept through the windows, he sat alone in the stillness, feeling the visitor's presence like a weight on his chest. The visitor was no longer just a sound or a knock. It was a part of him now, a shadow in his soul. The silence stretched endlessly, filled with a terrible knowledge. Some invitations once given cannot be taken back. The visitor had crossed the threshold, and now the question was not if it would leave, but when or if he could ever leave it behind. The visitor had become a silent occupant of his life, a shadow that moved with him through every room and every thought. The days blurred into one another, filled with the heavy weight of a presence that refused to be named. He found himself retreating further into silence, avoiding places where the visitor's influence seemed strongest. The apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a prison where the walls whispered secrets he was not meant to hear. The knocking was no longer just a sound. It was a memory, a reminder of a boundary crossed and a door left open. The visitor had claimed space inside him, and every breath he took was heavy with the knowledge that he was no longer alone. He tried to anchor himself to reality by creating routines, small acts of control in a life unraveling at the edges. Each morning he made the bed, each evening he locked the door, but these gestures felt hollow. The visitor did not respect locks or barriers. It was a force beyond physical boundaries, slipping through cracks in the mind and space. He caught himself staring at the door, heart pounding, expecting the knock that would never come again. The silence that followed the visitor's entry was deafening, a void filled with absence and cold. It was in that silence he felt the visitor's true power, a presence that consumed light and hope alike. The fear became a constant companion, whispering doubts and feeding shadows in his mind. He questioned everything, his sanity, his memories, his grasp on reality. Was this presence truly real, or a manifestation of his deepest fears? The visitor did not answer, only lingered. He longed for proof, for a sign that could be shared, a tangible evidence that he was not alone in this silent horror. But the visitor remained elusive, slipping between moments, hiding in the stillness. It was a darkness that could not be seen but felt in every breath, every heartbeat, and it was growing stronger. Isolation deepened as he withdrew from the world, afraid that sharing his terror would only bring disbelief or ridicule. Friends and family grew distant, unable to reach through the wall of silence and fear he built around himself. The visitor fed on this solitude, growing in strength and presence. The knocking was gone, replaced by a stillness that screamed louder than any sound. He lived in the shadow of a visitor who needed no invitation, a presence that lingered in the spaces between light and dark. He was caught in a web of silence and shadows, unsure if he could ever escape. Sleep became a battleground where the visitor ruled. His dreams twisted into labyrinths of silence and tapping, endless corridors where doors opened to darkness. The visitor appeared in dreams as a shadow just beyond reach, silent and watching. He woke in terror, the visitor's presence lingering like a cold fog in his room. Nights offered no refuge, only endless waiting and watching. The visitor had crossed the threshold and refused to leave, turning his home into a place where fear lived and breathed. Each breath was a reminder that the visitor was no longer just outside, it was inside, a part of his very being. He sought answers in books, legends, and whispered tales of the supernatural, desperate for a way to reclaim his life. But the visitor was unlike anything he found, no loud hauntings or violent spirits, but a quiet, patient force that waited and watched. The knocking had been a ritual, a test of permission, but the visitor no longer followed rules. It was a presence that moved without sound, without warning. He was trapped in a silent war, fighting an enemy that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. The visitor was no longer a visitor, it was a part of him. In the deepest silence of the night, he finally understood the cruel truth. The knocking only happened when he said, "Come in," but the visitor stayed, long after the knocking ceased. It was a shadow in his soul, a cold that would never leave. The invitation he gave in jest had become a prison, and as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, he sat alone with the visitor, the silent occupant of his life, and the terrible knowledge that some doors once opened can never be closed. The visitor's presence settled deeper into the fabric of his life, entwining with his every thought and movement. It was no longer just a haunting noise or an unseen shadow. It was an invisible weight, an ever-present chill that wrapped itself around his mind. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred until he couldn't trust his own senses. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of light, became a sign that the visitor was near, watching, waiting. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, quiet, suffocating, and filled with unseen eyes. He wondered if the visitor was feeding not just on fear but on his very life force, draining the warmth and hope from his soul with each passing day. In moments of rare clarity, he tried to fight back. He whispered prayers, spoke to empty rooms, tried to reclaim his home with words and rituals, learned from books and whispered legends. But the visitor did not answer. It did not react. It simply remained, an indifferent force that needed no recognition or permission anymore. The knocking, once a question, was now a memory. The visitor had crossed that threshold without consent and refused to leave. He felt powerless against a presence that was both everywhere and nowhere, a ghost tethered to his life by his own foolish invitation. The visitor was a shadow inside him, an unyielding part of his world. He began to notice changes in himself, small at first, then undeniable. His hands trembled without cause. His eyes grew hollow, reflecting the emptiness that spread inside. The visitor's silence echoed in his mind, a void that swallowed hope and sanity. He found himself talking to the visitor aloud, desperate for a response, for a sign that he was not alone. But the visitor was silent, and the silence was heavier than any scream. It pressed down on his chest, squeezed his heart, and tightened around his throat. He was a man trapped in a silent nightmare of his own making, haunted by a presence he could neither see nor banish. Isolation deepened as he withdrew from the outside world. The few friends who noticed his absence worried, but he was beyond reach. The visitor consumed his thoughts and energy, leaving no room for connection or escape. His home had become a prison with invisible bars, the visitor a guard who never spoke but never left. Every locked door and barred window felt meaningless against an enemy that moved through walls and minds alike. The knocking had been a warning, a test of will, and he had failed. The visitor was inside now, and the silence it brought was the real terror. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by endless nights of wakeful terror. His dreams were filled with endless corridors and doors that opened to nothing but darkness. The knocking echoed in those dreams, relentless and unanswered. The visitor appeared as a shifting shadow, just out of reach, watching silently. He woke each time with a start, drenched in sweat and shaking with fear. The visitor's presence lingered, a cold fog that seeped into every corner of his room. It was a reminder that the visitor had crossed the threshold, and now he was trapped inside with it. Desperation led him to seek help from those who dealt in the unseen: spiritualists, mediums, anyone who might offer a way to break the visitor's hold. But none could see the visitor, none could touch it. It was a presence without form, a shadow without substance. The visitor defied all attempts to name or bind it. Each visit ended in silence and failure, leaving him more isolated and broken. He realized that the visitor was not a creature of this world, but something else, something patient, eternal, and indifferent. It had come with the knocking, but now it stayed in the silence. In the darkest hours of the night, when the world was still, he faced the terrible truth. The knocking only happened when he said, "Come in," but the visitor was no longer bound by those words. It had crossed the threshold and stayed. It was a shadow in his soul, a cold that would never leave. The apartment was no longer his home. It was a battleground for a silent war he could never win. And as the first light of dawn crept through the window, he sat alone, the visitor's presence heavy in the air, knowing that some doors once opened could never be closed. The visitor's grip tightened with each passing day. Unseen yet undeniable, it filled the quiet spaces of his apartment, slipped through cracks in the walls, and lingered in the corners of his vision. Every moment was heavy with its presence, a silent weight pressing against his chest, making each breath a struggle. The visitor was no longer a distant knocking, but a shadow woven into the fabric of his life. A constant, cold companion he could neither see nor escape. The walls whispered secrets he couldn't understand, and the silence itself became a language of dread. It was a presence that demanded recognition, yet offered no answers in return. His reflection in the mirror showed a man transformed by fear and exhaustion. The eyes were sunken, the skin pale and drawn tight over bones. He no longer recognized himself, lost somewhere between the waking world and the nightmare the visitor had become. The visitor was inside him now, a shadow stitched to his soul, shaping his thoughts and actions in subtle, terrifying ways. He caught himself talking aloud, as if the visitor might answer, might speak back. But the silence remained absolute, a void filled only with the visitor's unyielding patience. It was a presence that neither needed nor desired communication. It existed simply to be, a dark weight on his existence. The knocking was a memory fading into darkness. It had once been a test, a ritual waiting for permission, but the visitor had crossed the threshold without consent, and now ruled in silence. Every attempt to banish it failed. Prayers, rituals, even desperate pleas to unseen forces brought no relief. The visitor was a patient conqueror, waiting for him to surrender fully. It was a force that did not need to shout to be terrifying. Its silence screamed louder than any noise, a quiet invasion that consumed hope and light. He lived in a prison built from silence and shadows, unable to escape the visitor's watchful gaze. Isolation wrapped around him like a shroud. Friends and family became distant echoes, voices muffled by the growing wall he built to protect himself from disbelief and fear. The visitor thrived in this solitude. Growing stronger with each day, he withdrew further from the world. The apartment became a tomb, filled with shadows and cold drafts, a place where fear lived and breathed. He was caught in a nightmare where the visitor held all the power, and the knocking was a forgotten relic of a time when boundaries still mattered. Now the visitor was the boundary, and it was unbreakable. The nights were the worst. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by endless hours of darkness and dread. His dreams were filled with endless corridors, doors that led nowhere, and the persistent tapping that had once been the visitor's call. In dreams, the visitor appeared as a shifting shadow, always just beyond reach, watching silently. He woke with a start, heart racing, sweat soaking his sheets. The visitor's presence lingered in the room like a cold fog, a reminder that it was not just outside the door. It was inside, a part of his life, his mind, his soul. The apartment was no longer safe. It never would be again. Desperation led him to seek answers from those who might understand the unseen: spiritualists, mediums, anyone with knowledge of the dark. But none could perceive the visitor, none could touch it or banish it. It was a presence beyond form, beyond the rules of the physical world. The visitor defied explanation, a patient, eternal force indifferent to his suffering. Each attempt to rid himself of it ended in failure, leaving him more isolated and broken. He realized the visitor was not a ghost or demon, but something else, something that had been invited in and refused to leave. It was a part of him now, a shadow in his soul. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world was still, he faced the truth with aching clarity. The knocking only happened when he said, "Come in," but the visitor did not leave. When the knocking stopped, it stayed, a shadow inside him, a cold that would never go away. The apartment was no longer his sanctuary, but a battleground for a war he could never win. And as the first light of morning filtered through the window, he sat alone with the visitor's presence heavy in the air, knowing some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The visitor had grown bolder, though it never made a sound. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough, a constant pressure that seemed to warp the air, twist the corners of his vision, and infect his thoughts. He no longer felt alone, not even for a moment. There was always the sense of someone standing just behind him, unseen but palpable, watching with a patience that terrified him more than any violent haunting ever could. The visitor's silence had a weight, like a heavy fog pressing against his chest, stealing his breath. Even the walls of the apartment seemed to pulse with its presence, as if the building itself had taken a breath and held it, waiting. His mind began to fracture under the relentless strain. The days outside became unreal, hazy and distant. The world beyond his door felt like a memory, and he wondered if he'd ever truly been a part of it. The apartment was his entire universe now, and the visitor had made itself the center of that universe. It wasn't possession, not in the way books described it, but something subtler, something more insidious. It had woven itself into the rhythm of his life. He no longer questioned when he had invited it in. That answer had come and gone. Now he asked himself a far worse question. Had the visitor always been here, waiting for the moment he noticed it? The knocking had been a courtesy, a thin veil of ritual masking the truth. The visitor had never needed permission. It had simply waited for acknowledgement. That quiet "come in," spoken half in jest, had done nothing but seal what had already begun. And now, with the knocking long gone, he understood the full horror of its silence. The visitor was not lingering outside anymore. It had taken root, not just in his home, but in him. It was a coldness inside his thoughts, a darkness that spread like ink through water, impossible to contain or push back. Sleep became a dangerous luxury. Each time he closed his eyes, he found himself in the same dreamscape, a vast, endless hallway lined with doors. Behind each one he felt the visitor waiting, its silent presence pressing against the thin barriers. Sometimes he dared to open a door, only to find nothing but darkness inside. Other times he heard faint breathing, slow and deliberate, as if the visitor was on the other side, waiting for him to step through. Waking brought no comfort. He often awoke to the subtle impression of weight at the foot of his bed, as though something had been sitting there, watching as he slept. He stopped, leaving the apartment entirely. At first, it was fear of what might follow him outside, of what others might see lurking behind his eyes. But soon, it felt impossible to leave, as though invisible hands kept him tethered to this place. The visitor seemed to prefer him isolated, cut off from any source of light or hope. When his phone rang, he let it die. When friends knocked, he stayed silent. The visitor filled every gap in his life, making him forget there had ever been a world beyond these walls. It was a slow erasure of self, and he could feel it happening. Desperation drove him to one last act of defiance. One night, standing in the middle of the apartment, he screamed into the darkness, demanding the visitor reveal itself, demanding it leave. The silence that followed was suffocating. No knock, no whisper, just the crushing certainty that the visitor had heard him and simply chosen not to answer. He collapsed to his knees, the cold from the floor seeping into his skin as a realization settled over him. The visitor had never been outside. It had always been here. It had always been waiting. As dawn broke, pale light spilling across the room, he felt the visitor's presence press closer than ever before. It was no longer something he feared might touch him. It was inside him now, a shadow curled around his heart, pulsing with quiet possession. The knocking only happened when he said, "Come in." But now, there were no knocks, no doors left to open or close. There was only him and the visitor, bound together in a silence that could never be broken. He no longer remembered the sound of his own voice. Days passed, or was it weeks, measured only by the shifting light at his window and the growing weight of the visitor's presence. It wasn't just in his apartment anymore. It was in his body, his thoughts curling tighter around his mind, like a constrictor. Even the simplest actions felt foreign. Mechanical, brushing his teeth, drinking water, staring blankly at his reflection. The man in the mirror looked hollowed out, his eyes twin voids, staring back with a dim light that barely flickered. Somewhere deep inside, a fragment of him still screamed to fight, but it was faint now, smothered beneath layers of cold silence. The visitor didn't need violence or chaos to dominate. It consumed through stillness, stripping him down to nothing, until he wasn't sure where he ended, and it began. Nightfall no longer carried meaning, nor did the rising sun. Time had folded in on itself. He existed in a perpetual dusk, where minutes stretched into eternities. The visitor was patient. It didn't move, didn't announce itself, yet its presence pressed in closer, so close he could almost feel its breath against his skin. Sometimes, as he lay motionless in bed, he sensed it leaning over him, unseen eyes studying every inch of his face. He didn't dare move or speak. Even the slightest sound felt dangerous, a ripple in the suffocating calm. He had thought fear would consume him, but now there was no room for it. Only numbness remained, and beneath that, an almost reverent awareness that he was no longer entirely his own. Attempts to reclaim himself became fewer, weaker. Once he had scoured books, whispered prayers, sought rituals and symbols to banish the intruder, but each effort dissolved into futility, swallowed by the impenetrable quiet. The visitor was not something to exercise or defeat. It was not bound by rules or holy words. It existed in a place beyond comprehension, a darkness older than belief, more patient than any human spirit could endure. He came to realize with creeping horror that the visitor had not crossed into his world. It had simply allowed him to notice its world overlapping his. The knocking had been a courtesy, a thin veil of civility from something that had never truly been outside at all. It had always been here, and now it was simply waiting for him to understand what that meant. Sleep offered no escape. When his eyes closed, he found himself in that endless hallway again, surrounded by doors that pulsed faintly like living things. Behind each door, he felt the visitor's presence, thicker, heavier, growing stronger. Sometimes in those dreams, he heard the faint echo of knocking again, but it was different now, slower, deliberate, like a heartbeat deep within the walls. Once he gathered enough courage to open one of the doors, only to be swallowed by a darkness so complete. He felt his mind unravel. He woke screaming, gasping for air, only to find the room around him colder than ice, and the impression of weight pressed into the mattress beside him. The visitor had followed him from dream to waking, and now there was no clear line dividing the two. Food lost all flavor. Hunger came and went like a passing thought, ignored more often than not. His body grew thin, frail, bones jutting sharply beneath pale skin. But he barely noticed. His existence had narrowed to a single focus, the presence in the apartment, the one that waited silently, watching. He couldn't tell if the visitor had a shape, a form lurking just beyond his vision, or if it was the absence of shape, a void given intention. Sometimes he thought he caught glimpses of movement in mirrors, or the glass of his darkened window, a ripple of shadow, a suggestion of something tall and still. But whenever he turned his head, there was only emptiness. That was its power. The visitor did not need to be seen to dominate him utterly. One night, as the wind howled faintly outside, he heard it again, not the knocking, but the sound of a door creaking somewhere deep in the apartment. He froze, every muscle locking tight, as his ears strained. Another sound followed, a soft exhale, too close, too deliberate,
to be imagined. He knew then that the visitor was no longer content to linger in the periphery. It was moving closer, step by step, through the threshold it had already crossed. His breath came shallow, panic blooming in his chest for the first time in days. But even as terror rose, he found he could not move. His body betrayed him, heavy as stone, pinned by a force he could neither see nor fight. As dawn's pale light seeped through the blinds, he remained where he was, motionless, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. The visitor had not shown itself, not fully, but he felt its presence pressed against him like a second skin. It no longer lingered in shadows or drafts. It had entered him completely. He was no longer certain. He was still alone in his own body. The realization came softly, with the quiet horror of inevitability. The visitor had stopped knocking, because there were no doors left to open. There was no threshold anymore. There was only him, and it and the silence they shared.
The days became unmarked stretches of darkness and pale light, where hours dissolved like grains of salt in water. He barely noticed any more when night fell or dawn broke. Both seemed the same, dim, cold, and suffocating. The visitor's presence had shifted again, growing denser, more intimate. It wasn't content to linger unseen at the edges of rooms now. It pressed against him constantly, a cold pressure that settled into his skin, his thoughts, his very breath. He could no longer tell where he ended, and it began. His hands, when he looked at them, didn't feel like his own. Sometimes he flexed his fingers, half expecting the movement to stop, for the visitor to reveal that it now commanded even this small autonomy. But the fingers moved obediently, and somehow that was worse. The visitor had no need to take control, not when it could quietly, patiently inhabit him from the inside. He began hearing things in the silence, not loud, intrusive noises, but faint sounds woven into the stillness, breathing that wasn't his own. The subtle shift of weight on the floorboards, a slow, deliberate drag of something soft across the walls. Each sound was enough to make his stomach clench and his heart stutter, but he never moved to investigate. He didn't have to. He knew what he would, or wouldn't, find. The visitor didn't need form. It didn't need footsteps. It simply was, filling every atom of the apartment and every thought in his mind. The knocking had been replaced by these soft intimations of presence, as if the visitor no longer felt the need to ask for permission. It had become permission itself. His reflection became a stranger's. The man staring back at him in the bathroom mirror had hollowed cheeks and bloodshot eyes ringed in deep purple shadows. His lips were cracked, his skin ashen, and yet the expression wasn't entirely his. There was something subtle, but wrong in the set of his jaw, in the faint upturn at the corner of his mouth, like a smile trying to form without his consent. It was there and then gone when he blinked, leaving only his own trembling face. He stopped looking after that, covering mirrors with towels and avoiding windows at night. But the feeling persisted, that he was being watched not just from outside but from within. The visitor wasn't waiting anymore. It was observing. At first he thought he might be going mad. But madness, he realized, would be a mercy. Madness would mean the visitor wasn't real. This was worse. This was knowing in his bones that the visitor's silence was deliberate, that it was still moving, still shifting, still doing things in the unseen corners of his home and his mind. Sometimes he caught glimpses of something moving just beyond his peripheral vision, but turning his head brought only emptiness. It wasn't emptiness, though. It was stillness, alive and patient. The visitor didn't have to be visible to be there. It didn't even have to breathe. It simply existed, unblinking,
tireless and endless. Sleep, when it came, offered no reprieve. The hallway returned, longer than before, lined with doors that now pulsed faintly like living hearts. Behind each, he felt a familiar weight, a growing pressure that throbbed like something trying to push through. Sometimes the knocking returned in his dreams, slow and heavy, but now accompanied by a low whispering that made his skin crawl. He could never make out words, only the cadence of something speaking directly into his mind. He woke with the sound still echoing in his ears, his body drenched in sweat, and his sheets twisted around him like restraints. The visitor's presence lingered after these dreams, stronger than ever, as though a part of it had followed him back into the waking world. Days melted together in suffocating monotony. The visitor began to influence even his smallest actions, where he sat, how he breathed, the rhythm of his blinking. He felt like a marionette with invisible strings, not fully controlled, but gently guided. And each time he tried to resist, forcing himself to stand, to leave, to speak, the air thickened around him, heavy and cold, as if warning him not to. He stayed. Of course he stayed. The apartment was no longer just a building. It had become the visitor's domain, and he its unwilling tenant. Outside was no longer an option. There was no outside anymore. Only the walls of this place, closing tighter each day. One night, as a faint breeze rattled the blinds, he thought he heard it again, the sound of a door opening somewhere in the apartment. But this time, he didn't freeze. He didn't even feel fear. Instead, a profound stillness settled over him, so absolute it felt alien. He didn't need to turn his head to know what had happened. The visitor was no longer in the periphery. It was no longer something separate from him, something beyond the door. It was here. It was in him. It had been patient, careful, methodical. The knocking had been a beginning. The silence was the end. The transformation was no longer subtle. He felt it in every breath, in the heavy stillness of the apartment, in the way his thoughts began to echo, as if two voices shared the same mind. The visitor didn't need to speak aloud. It whispered without words, its intention seeping directly into his consciousness, like oil spreading in water. Sometimes he caught himself thinking thoughts that weren't his, strange alien strings of emotion and memory that felt older than him, colder than anything human. They came and went like fragments of a life that wasn't his own. His reflection in the dark window grew stranger each night. The man staring back wore a faint, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes. It lingered even when he wasn't trying to smile, as though his face was beginning to belong to someone or something else. The apartment felt smaller now. The air seemed heavier, as though thick with unseen currents that moved around him, pressing against his skin, his lungs, his very thoughts. He began losing time. Hours vanished without explanation. Sometimes he would wake standing in the center of the living room, staring blankly at the front door, unsure how long he had been there, or why. Once, he woke sitting on the bed's edge, muttering softly to himself, in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own. He could feel the visitor's presence stronger than ever during these moments, not around him but inside him, a patient observer trying on his life, like a new set of clothes. Dreams became indistinguishable from reality. The hallway in his sleep was no longer a place he entered, but a place that followed him into waking hours. He would see the faint outlines of doors shimmering in his periphery, feel the oppressive weight of the visitor pressing against them from the other side. And in the dreams, the knocking returned, not from outside, but from within the walls,
under the floorboards, behind his ribcage. It was slow, deliberate, as though knocking from inside his own body. Sometimes he pressed a hand to his chest, swearing he could feel faint vibrations there, as if something unseen was testing the strength of his bones. He stopped eating almost entirely. Hunger didn't feel real anymore. He couldn't remember the taste of food, the sensation of thirst. His body felt foreign, a vessel maintained not by will but by the visitor's quiet insistence. His hands moved when he didn't tell them to, tapping out strange rhythmic patterns on the table, tracing shapes in the condensation on the window. At first, he thought it was nervous habit, but the patterns were too deliberate, too precise. When he realized they matched the cadence of the old knocking, a cold wave of horror ran through him. The visitor wasn't content to reside silently anymore. It was teaching his body, coaxing it into habits that weren't his. The outside world had ceased to exist. He no longer remembered the sound of traffic, the warmth of sunlight, or the comfort of another human voice. Even if he wanted to leave, he wasn't sure he could. The thought of opening the door filled him with a bone-deep dread that felt like his own, and yet not his own. He didn't need locks anymore. The visitor was the lock. It held him in place with an invisible tether, a quiet pressure that whispered without sound, "Stay, this is where you belong." And deep down, in some terrible weakening part of himself, he believed it. He didn't fight anymore, because he wasn't sure there was anything left to fight. One night, as he lay motionless in bed, he felt it fully for the first time, not just near him or inside his thoughts, but layered over him like a second skin. A cold weight pressed him into the mattress, his own chest rising and falling, not with his breath, but with the visitor's slow, deliberate rhythm. His hands twitched slightly in the darkness, fingers curling in patterns he didn't control. A soft, nearly inaudible sound filled the room, a sigh, not his own. The visitor had ceased to be an intruder. It had become the dominant presence. He was the guest now, a fading echo within his own body, and the visitor had finally stepped through every door. He woke to silence, so profound it felt alive. The kind of silence that smothered thought, that pressed against the skull until the very idea of sound seemed unnatural. His body felt alien, his arms heavy, his chest tight, his breath shallow and deliberate, as though each inhale and exhale were no longer under his control. He tried to move his fingers and found they responded a second too late, sluggish and strange, like marionettes tugged by an invisible hand. Panic flared briefly, but even that felt muted, distant, as if he were no longer the sole inhabitant of his mind. The visitor wasn't waiting anymore. It wasn't knocking. It was walking the halls of his consciousness, exploring, settling in. His thoughts were no longer private. He felt them ripple, then twist, like water disturbed by an unseen presence. Images appeared in his mind unbidden. Long corridors, faint doorways, endless darkness. They weren't memories, yet they carried the weight of something ancient and real. A slow realization settled in his gut. These weren't his thoughts, they were its. The visitor wasn't content to occupy his home or his body. It wanted his mind, his very self, to hollow him out until there was nothing left but its echo. He tried to resist, to force his own voice forward, but the words caught in his throat like stones. He wasn't sure he could even remember what his voice sounded like anymore. Time ceased to function in a way he could understand. Minutes bled into hours, hours into days, or maybe it was only moments, stretched impossibly thin under the weight of the visitor's presence. He saw less and less of his own reflection in the covered mirrors, caught faint glimpses of movement beneath the towels when he passed them. A flicker of a smile, a tilt of the head, subtle gestures not his own. His body was becoming a suit worn by something older, colder. He felt his lips curve into expressions he didn't choose. Once he heard himself laugh, a low, hollow sound that made his stomach twist. It wasn't his laugh. It had never been his laugh. In his dreams there were no more doors. The endless hallway had vanished, replaced by a vast open space of suffocating darkness. He floated there, weightless, and knew without knowing that the visitor had no need for doors anymore. It had crossed all thresholds. It stood over him in the void, a shape without shape, a presence without form. He couldn't see it, but he felt its essence pour into him, filling the cracks and empty spaces of his soul, until he could no longer tell where he ended and it began. He wanted to scream, but there was no mouth, no sound, only silence. The visitor's silence, and in that silence, a terrible truth bloomed like frost. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a vessel. When he woke, he wasn't sure he was alone. His body moved with subtle hesitations, as if shared between two minds. He found himself standing at the window, staring at the street below for hours without memory of walking there. His hand lifted to touch the glass, fingers splaying, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw something in the reflection, a tall, dark figure standing just behind him. But when he blinked, there was only his own hollow-eyed face, and a smile curling his lips. He didn't feel himself smiling, yet there it was. He no longer trusted his own movements, no longer knew if they were his. The visitor had settled so deeply into him that there was no line left to cross. He wasn't sure there had ever been one. The final surrender came not with a fight, but with a quiet, weary acceptance. One night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he felt the visitor curl itself fully around his mind, its presence no longer distinct from his own. He didn't struggle. He didn't even flinch as his fingers twitched in patterns he didn't recognize, or as his breath came in unfamiliar rhythms. The fear was gone now, burned out by the sheer exhaustion of resisting. In its place was a stillness that was almost comforting. He understood at last what the visitor had waited for, not consent, not submission, but the erasure of self. It didn't need to take control. It needed only to let him fade. And so he did. When morning came, the man who rose from the bed wasn't entirely the one who had laid down. His movements were smooth, deliberate, his eyes calm and unfathomable. He walked the apartment in silence, tracing fingers along the walls as though reacquainting himself with the space, not with fear or anxiety, but with ownership. The visitor had finally taken root, fully and completely. The knocking had been a prelude, a polite question, but there were no knocks anymore, no doors, no boundaries. There was only it and the shell it now wore. The man who walked out of the apartment one overcast morning wasn't the same one who had disappeared inside weeks ago. Neighbors, if they noticed him at all, would have sworn there was nothing unusual about his posture, his measured steps, his calm expression. Yet something in his presence made their stomachs tighten inexplicably, an animal instinct whispering that something wasn't right. His eyes didn't scan the street or catch the sun. They stared straight ahead, unblinking, as though seeing something far beyond the world in front of him. Even the air around him seemed subtly different, too still, too heavy, as though it carried a weight no one could name. Friends began to call. At first it was with worry, voicemails filled with concern, gentle questions about where he had been. Then, as days passed, and he failed to answer, worry turned to irritation. When someone finally saw him walking the street, they waved and called his name. He stopped, but didn't turn. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something else, and then he kept walking. The friends' laughter faltered, turning into confusion. They told themselves maybe he hadn't heard them. Maybe he was lost in thought. But deep down, something about his stillness, as he paused, too perfect, too patient, clung to them like a cold wind, long after he'd disappeared from view. At his workplace, whispers started. He returned after weeks of absence, without explanation, sitting at his desk with eerie composure. Colleagues found themselves lowering their voices around him without knowing why. They couldn't quite say what was wrong. He worked diligently, spoke sparingly, smiled occasionally, but the smiles didn't feel warm. They felt rehearsed, like someone practicing a gesture they didn't fully understand. A co-worker swore she saw him standing perfectly still in the break room long after everyone else had gone, staring at the wall with a faint upward curl on his lips. She told herself she was imagining it, but she avoided the break room for the rest of the week. Outside, the city seemed to react in subtle ways. Streetlights flickered when he passed beneath them. Stray animals kept their distance, fur bristling and tails tucked between their legs. Children glanced at him, then quickly looked away, clutching their parents' hands tighter. A shopkeeper noticed him standing across the street one evening, unmoving for what felt like hours. When the man finally walked away, the shopkeeper realized he'd been holding his breath the entire time. People didn't talk about these things. They didn't have words for the quiet unease that clung to him like a second shadow. At night, neighbors heard strange noises from his apartment, not loud or violent, but soft, rhythmic sounds that raised the hairs on the back of their necks. A low humming, a faint tapping like fingers on wood, and once a quiet voice repeating a single word they couldn't quite make out. One woman swore she heard the words come in whispered in the hallway outside her door, though she lived 2 floors below. She locked her door tighter that night, heart pounding, and didn't sleep until the sun came up. His friends started to drift away, their concern curdling into fear. Messages went unanswered. Calls rang endlessly. A few tried visiting, standing nervously outside his apartment door. But as they raised their hands to knock, a heavy sense of dread stopped them cold. One swore she felt someone standing on the other side of the door, waiting, too close, too silent. She lowered her hand and left without knocking, unable to explain why her legs were trembling so violently. None of them tried again, and so he was left alone. Or perhaps that had always been the visitor's intention. The apartment remained dim and still, its air thick with a silence so deep it felt alive. The man moved quietly inside, his footsteps soft, his breath calm, his motions precise. The visitor had no need to announce itself now. It had fully settled into its new home, and outside, the world seemed to sense it too, though no one could say why. They only felt the chill that lingered long after he passed by, a silent warning that something unseen had crossed a threshold it was never meant to cross. The man's life now unfolded with mechanical precision. He woke at the same time each morning, moved through the apartment with movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed, and left for work without ever rushing or slowing. His neighbors spoke in hushed tones about how unnaturally quiet his footsteps were, how he never made a sound inside his apartment, not a cough, not a laugh, not even the faint shuffle of furniture. Some claimed they never saw his lights on at night, yet swore they'd catch glimpses of him standing in his window long after midnight, motionless, staring into the street as though waiting for something unseen. The stillness around him was suffocating. Wherever he went, a faint unease trailed in his wake, unnoticed consciously but felt all the same like an aftertaste of dread no one could explain. At work, he continued his tasks with flawless efficiency, but even that perfection seemed unsettling. He no longer spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his voice carried a strange cadence, measured, soft, almost too calm. His co-workers avoided meeting his gaze for long. His eyes no longer reflected curiosity or warmth, but held a deep, unblinking stillness that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Once, someone dropped a heavy stack of papers near his desk. The sound echoed sharply in the room, startling everyone except him. He didn't even flinch. His head turned slowly toward the noise, his expression placid, and for a moment his lips twitched into a faint smile that chilled them to the bone. He no longer carried a phone. No one knew why. Old friends still tried calling sometimes, but his number had been disconnected. Social media accounts were deleted without fanfare, as though he'd never existed online. When people spoke of him now, they used cautious language, as though discussing a stranger. One woman at his office whispered about how she'd seen him standing perfectly still in the bathroom, staring into the mirror for nearly 20 minutes without blinking. Another swore she heard him humming softly to himself, but couldn't remember the tune, even though it had left her too uneasy to sleep that night. Slowly, people stopped asking where he had been all those weeks, stopped wondering what had changed. It was easier that way. But the world outside was shifting in quiet, dreadful ways. In a neighborhood several blocks away, a young woman woke one night to a faint sound at her door. She sat up, heart pounding, as a slow, deliberate knocking echoed through her apartment. It wasn't frantic or loud, just calm, patient, like someone confident they'd eventually be let in. She clutched her phone, debating calling the police, but something about the knock made her hesitate. It felt wrong, not threatening exactly, but wrong, as though the person knocking wasn't entirely right. When she gathered enough courage to whisper, "Who's there?" no answer came, but the knocking persisted, steady and unhurried. The next morning, she told herself it had been a dream. She went about her day with forced normalcy, but that night, as she drifted toward sleep, the sound came again. 3 slow knocks, silence, then 3 more. Her breath hitched. She lay frozen, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced. It was just the wind, she told herself. Old pipes, anything but what it felt like. A patient visitor waiting on the other side of the door. And though she never spoke the words aloud, deep in her mind, something whispered dangerously close to consent. "Come in." She didn't know where the thought had come from, or if it had been hers at all. Elsewhere, the man continued his routine, oblivious to, or perhaps aware of, the ripple beginning anew. He moved through his days without interruption, his presence a silent weight wherever he went. And at night, when he returned to his apartment, he stood for long moments in the darkness, staring at the door, as though listening. No one dared to knock anymore. They didn't need to. The visitor had moved beyond knocking, and in a dimly lit apartment blocks away, as the young woman held her breath and listened to the steady tapping on her door, the cycle prepared to begin again. The knocking had never truly stopped. It had simply waited, and now it had found a new door. The knocking returned the next night. It was just after midnight, 3 slow, deliberate raps against her apartment door that echoed in the stillness like a question waiting to be answered. She sat up in bed, clutching the blanket to her chest, heart hammering as her mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe a neighbor had the wrong door. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, she knew neither was true. The sound was too precise, too calm. It didn't feel like a mistake. She tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket over her head like a child warding off monsters. But the knocking came again. 3 beats, perfectly spaced, as if the visitor had all the time in the world. She didn't sleep. Her phone lay in her hand all night, thumb hovering over 911. But something stopped her from dialing. She couldn't explain why. It wasn't fear of looking foolish. It was fear of breaking the fragile calm that clung to her apartment. The knocking was patient, restrained, almost polite. Somehow she felt that calling for help would change it, make it angry, or worse. So she waited, eyes wide in the dark, until dawn's pale light finally filtered through her curtains. The silence that greeted her was almost as unsettling as the knocking. She rose from the bed on trembling legs and crept to the door. Nothing, no one. But when she pressed her ear to the wood, she swore she could feel a faint vibration, as though something on the other side was still there, waiting. Over the next few days, the knocking became a nightly ritual. Always 3 slow raps, always at the same hour. Sometimes she thought she heard faint movement in the hall outside, soft footsteps, the rustle of fabric. But every time she peered through the peephole, the corridor stood empty. Her neighbors didn't seem to notice. When she asked casually if anyone had heard knocking late at night, they only shook their heads, distracted. Their answers clipped. She stopped asking after a while. It felt like breaking an unspoken rule. She couldn't shake the sense that mentioning it out loud might give the visitor more power, make it more real. And in her chest, deep down where logic faltered, a terrifying thought began to bloom. It already is real. By the 5th night, she started hearing it, even when she was awake during the day. Not full knocks, but faint tapping sounds on the windows, the walls, even the bathroom mirror. She told herself it was her nerves, a trick of her imagination, but she couldn't shake the dread pooling in her stomach, a visceral certainty that the visitor was growing restless. That night, when the knocking came, her defenses cracked. She whispered before she could stop herself, voice shaking, "Who's there?" Silence answered her, heavy and suffocating. The air in the apartment seemed to grow denser, harder to breathe. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it echoed inside her skull anyway. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, over and over like a heartbeat. Her sleep became fragmented, plagued by vivid dreams. In them she stood in a long hallway lined with closed doors, each one identical. From behind some doors, she heard faint breathing. From others, slow knocking, so deep and resonant it vibrated through her bones. She felt compelled to open one, but terror rooted her in place. The longer she stood there, the stronger the sense of presence grew, something watching her, not with eyes but with intent, patient and endless. She woke from each dream, gasping, drenched in sweat, her body trembling. But even then she couldn't shake the lingering impression that she hadn't truly woken up, that she had brought something back with her from the dream. On the 7th night, the knocking didn't stop. After 3 beats, it came again and again, unhurried but relentless, like the steady tolling of a distant bell. She curled on the couch, hands over her ears, whispering to herself to drown it out. It's not real. It's not real. But the knocking only grew louder in her mind.
reverberating through her chest, as if it had already crossed her threshold, and somewhere inside her, an unbidden voice whispered the words she had been trying so hard not to say. Words that felt like surrender. "Come in." She clamped a hand over her mouth, horrified, as though saying it aloud would tear open the thin barrier, keeping the visitor at bay. But it didn't need her voice anymore. She felt it in the room with her, now silent, invisible, pressing against her skin like a cold fog. She didn't hear footsteps or breathing. She didn't need to. The air itself seemed to pulse with awareness, and in the stillness, she felt the truth settle like a stone in her gut. The knocking had never been a request. It had been a warning, and now there were no knocks. No doors, only her, and the visitor that had already begun to step inside.
The road seemed endless. She had been walking for what felt like hours, days perhaps. Time had become meaningless in this hollow world. The fog thickened around her, curling like fingers against her skin, whispering her name in voices she almost recognized. Her feet were raw and bloodied, each step leaving crimson smears on cracked asphalt. She clutched the priest's journal tight against her chest, though its words had begun to blur, the ink bleeding across the pages as if the book itself wept. Above her, the sky churned with slow, roiling clouds, grey-black and too low, as though the heavens had collapsed closer to earth. Occasionally, faint vibrations trembled beneath her feet, like something massive shifting far underground. And always, always, the knocking. Tap, 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 slow, patient. She pressed her hands against her ears, but the sound reverberated from inside her skull. It wasn't coming from anywhere outside. It was part of her now. Ahead, lights flickered through the fog, weak yellow glows that drew her like a moth to flame. A gas station. Its sign hung askew, buzzing faintly, one letter flickering in and out. Relief stabbed through her exhaustion, though her stomach churned with dread. It had been so long since she'd seen light that she almost didn't trust it. Was it safety or a trap? She approached cautiously, knife gripped tight in her bleeding hand, her other clutching the journal. The door stood open, swaying slightly on rusted hinges, and a faint hum came from within. She stepped inside and was met with stale air and silence. The shelves were ransacked, food scattered across the floor, and the cash register stood open, coins spilled like offerings. But there was no blood, no bodies, just emptiness. Her eyes darted around, muscles taut, waiting for movement. Then she saw it. Behind the counter, etched deep into the wall with what looked like fingernails. The door is open, her breath hitched. The phrase followed her everywhere, a refrain echoing across broken homes, twisted streets, now even here. She closed her eyes, gripping the journal tighter. The priest's voice seemed to rise from its pages, his final warnings playing over and over in her mind. They knock because they do not need to break in. The threshold is the soul. Once heard, the sound binds them to you. Her heart pounded as she realized what he had meant. The knocking wasn't simply a herald. It was an infection, a seed planted in anyone who heard it. She staggered backward, knocking over a display of snacks, sending plastic wrappers rustling across the linoleum. The sound was deafening in the stillness, and her hands shook as she pressed them against her ears again. Stop, please stop. But the knocking continued. Tap, 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 tap. A sudden movement caught her eye. At the far end of the store, a man crouched against the refrigerated drinks, his back to her. His shoulders shook with ragged sobs. and a faint, wet sound accompanied each breath. Relief warred with terror. Another survivor. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Something about him felt wrong. His head turned slightly, and she froze. From this angle, she could see that his skin was grey, stretched thin over sharp bones, and his fingers were too long, too thin, nails clicking against the tile as they twitched. He spoke, his voice low and trembling, yet layered as though a chorus whispered beneath it. It knocks and knocks and knocks, and I let it in. Slowly he began to rise, joints cracking in unnatural directions. His head turned further than it should have, revealing empty sockets where eyes should have been. Yet somehow she felt his gaze pierce her to the core. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on a toppled chair, and fell hard against the counter. The noise echoed, and the man, or what had been a man, tilted its head in curiosity. Then it smiled, mouth stretching impossibly wide, teeth too numerous, too sharp. "It's so much quieter once it's inside," it whispered. "You should open your door too." The creature's long fingers tapped rhythmically against the glass cooler beside it. Tap, tap, tap. Each sound thundered through her skull, her vision blurring as nausea rose in her throat. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the crucifix so tightly the edges cut into her palm. Without thinking, she flung the vial of holy water she'd taken from the church. The bottle shattered against the floor, and the creature screamed, smoke rising from where drops had splashed its feet. It recoiled, retreating into the shadows with inhuman speed, its voice echoing as it vanished. "You cannot run forever." The knocking follows. She didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing a flashlight from behind the counter, she fled into the night, her breath ragged, legs trembling with exhaustion. The fog had thickened, swallowing everything beyond the faint circle of light. She didn't know where to go. Every road led back to the same endless loop. Every house whispered the same chilling refrain. Tap, tap, tap. Her mind screamed at her to rest, but she knew sleep would be no sanctuary. The priest's words echoed again in her mind. Sleep is their favorite door. Ahead, a sign loomed in the fog, its letters barely visible. "Welcome to Briar Ridge." She froze. Briar Ridge. She'd already passed that sign hours ago, or had it been days. Time no longer obeyed any rules here. The knocking quickened slightly, each tap more insistent than the last. She realized with dawning horror that the world wasn't looping. She was, and somewhere deep inside, a faint voice, not her own, whispered, amused and tender, "You've already opened the door."
The fog was heavier now, thick and suffocating, clinging to her skin like a cold, wet shroud. It distorted everything, the world around her, her own sense of time, even the sound of her footsteps. Each step echoed strangely, sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind. She gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam cutting only a few feet into the grey soup, revealing fleeting glimpses of the road, faded lane lines, broken bottles, and occasionally dark stains. She couldn't bring herself to investigate. The knocking hadn't stopped. Tap, tap, tap. Sometimes it was faint, like the gentle rapping of knuckles on wood. Other times it boomed, like fists pounding on a door she couldn't find. She pressed her palms over her ears, but the sound only grew louder, vibrating through her bones. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside her head, nestled deep, like a second heartbeat she could not silence. She stumbled past another house. The windows were dark,
the front door ajar, swaying faintly in the wind. For a moment she thought she saw movement inside, shadowy forms shifting behind curtains, but when she blinked, they were gone. Still, the air felt heavier near the house, and she could swear she heard faint whispers. Curiosity gnawed at her, but the priest's words echoed from the journal, clutched tight against her chest. Every threshold invites them closer. Every glance gives them shape. Look away. She forced herself to keep moving, though her steps faltered. Her exhaustion was a predator now, stalking her with every mile. Her vision blurred, colors dulling, the world reduced to shades of gray and black. The flashlight flickered, then steadied, though the fog seemed to pulse faintly, in and out, like a breathing lung. She realized with a shiver that it wasn't fog, it was them. The realization rooted her in place. The fog wasn't natural, it was alive, coiling and shifting as countless unseen forms writhed within it. She could sense them pressing closer now, their whispers louder, weaving into a single coherent chant. We are already inside. She staggered backward, clutching the crucifix so tightly, her palm throbbed with pain. The knocking returned, sharper now. Tap, tap, tap. This time it came from beneath her feet, the sound reverberating through the cracked asphalt. She dropped to her knees, pressing her hands against the road, and felt it, a subtle but steady vibration, as if something massive and patient moved far below. The journal fell open beside her, its pages fluttering wildly in a wind she couldn't feel. One phrase stood out, scrawled across a torn page. They wait below, they wait within. She snapped the book shut with trembling hands, her breath ragged as she forced herself upright. She couldn't stay here. Staying meant opening. She staggered forward, each step heavier than the last. Her legs felt like lead, her mind fogged with exhaustion and despair. She couldn't remember why she was still moving, only that stopping meant surrendering. Then faintly, she heard a sound unlike the knocking. Laughter. It was high-pitched and childlike, carried on the wind. She froze. Ahead, barely visible through the fog, a small figure stood in the road. It was a little girl, barefoot, her nightgown stained dark around the hem. The girl tilted her head, smiling with an expression too wide for her small face. "Mommy?" the girl said, her voice impossibly familiar. The woman's heart twisted painfully as recognition struck her like a hammer. Her daughter, or something wearing her daughter's face. She took a step forward before the priest's warning screamed in her mind. They will use what you love. Do not speak. Do not touch. Do not trust. The girl's smile widened, teeth too sharp, too many. Why did you leave me? It asked, voice warping, overlapping with countless others. Its head tilted further, cracking at an unnatural angle. It's cold out here. Let me in. The thing took a step forward, bare feet, leaving no prints in the wet asphalt. Tap, tap, tap. With each step the knocking grew louder, pounding in her skull like war drums. She raised the crucifix, her hands shaking violently, and forced her lips to form words. The prayer came out hoarse, broken, but the creature hissed and halted, its smile faltering for the first time. The fog behind it seethed angrily, shapes twisting and writhing. Days began to melt, features dripping like wax, until there was only a blank expanse of grey skin. "You can't keep it out," it whispered, voice now deep and echoing. "The door is open. You opened it the first night you listened." She screamed and turned, fleeing into the suffocating fog. Her legs pumped weakly, each stride a battle against the pull of exhaustion and despair. The knocking followed, now deafening, merging with the sound of her ragged breath and pounding heart. Tap, tap, tap. She didn't know how far she ran before the fog thinned slightly, revealing a crumbling overpass ahead. She stumbled toward it, her feet sliding on loose gravel. Underneath, there was darkness deeper than the night itself, but she had no choice. Her body moved on instinct, driven by the primal need to hide. As she collapsed against the cold concrete, her chest heaving, she realized she was no longer alone. From the shadows came a voice, calm and patient. "You've been running in circles. There is no escape, only the inevitable knock." The voice in the darkness was not loud, yet it filled every corner of her mind, vibrating in her bones like a low, relentless hum. There was never a door. The words curled around her like smoke, warm and venomous, making her skin crawl. She pressed her back, harder against the cold concrete of the overpass, gripping the crucifix until the metal bit into her palm. Her heart slammed in her chest. Every beat a drum she feared would summon what lurked just out of sight. The flashlight had long since died, leaving only faint grey light from the fog drifting in at the edges. Shadows twisted beyond her reach, moving with slow purpose. They did not rush. They didn't need to, because they weren't coming for her. They were already here. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed faintly from the concrete above, though her mind whispered that it was not outside. It had never been outside. A cold wind passed through the underpass, carrying with it the scent of rot and damp earth. She felt it settle in her lungs, heavy and suffocating. The priest's journal lay open beside her, pages flapping weakly in the breeze. Her eyes locked on a final entry she hadn't noticed before, one written in a hand not quite human, the letters jagged and claw-like. The first knock is the warning, the second the invitation, the third the binding. She read the words again and again, her breath hitching as realization struck. She had heard 3 knocks. The first night when she'd dismissed it as the wind, the second when it came louder and closer, and she froze in terror, and the third, the one she couldn't remember, though something inside her screamed that she had answered. "You answered, didn't you?" The voice was no longer outside her head. It was inside her thoughts, curling and hissing, each word sweet and venomous. She clamped her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth as her tears fell hot and fast. "No," she whispered hoarsely. I didn't let you in." But even as the words left her lips, she felt them hollow, weak. Memories twisted and fractured. Her home, the knocks, her husband's scream, her daughter's cold hand in hers. But the details were wrong. The house wasn't hers, the voice wasn't her husband's, and her daughter's eyes had glowed faint red in the dark. The knocking was never outside the door. It had been in her mind, tapping softly until the cracks appeared. Tap, tap, tap. Now she understood why the streets were empty, why the world seemed folded in on itself. This wasn't her town. It wasn't even the world. This was the place behind the door. You opened it, and we walked through you. The voice was behind her now, or perhaps beneath her skin. A sudden chill spread through her body, and she felt her limbs grow heavy, her fingers numb. She tried to stand, but her legs refused to move. Shadows gathered at the edges of her vision, writhing closer, shaping themselves into figures tall and thin, with too many joints and smiles that never ended. They didn't step into the light. They didn't need to. She could feel them inside her, like worms burrowing into soft earth. A scream built in her throat, but never emerged. Instead, a soft, rhythmic tapping came from her chest. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart wasn't beating anymore. It was knocking. "We are not invaders. You invited us." Every soul is a door, every knock a question, you answered. Tears blurred her vision as she clawed weakly at her own chest, a desperate, instinctive attempt to pull whatever it was out of her. The priest's journal slipped from her grasp, landing open to a page stained dark with old blood. The words blurred and shifted, rearranging themselves into a new message. There is no exorcism for what is already home. Her breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as the shadows pressed closer. The overpass groaned above her, cracks spiderwebbing through the concrete, as if the weight of something colossal bore down on it. She realized she couldn't hear the outside world anymore. No wind, no distant echoes, no sound but the knocking. Tap, 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 louder now, faster. The figure stepped from the darkness at last. It was impossibly tall, its head brushing the underpass ceiling, though its body was lean and impossibly thin. Its arms hung unnaturally long, fingers dragging against the ground with soft, deliberate clicks. It had no face, yet she felt its gaze intimate, invasive, knowing. It knelt before her, head tilting like a curious animal, and spoke with a voice that was every voice she had ever loved. There is no need to run anymore. You are open. You are ours. A cold hand touched her cheek, and the world tilted violently. She saw flashes, other doors opening, other souls answering. Cities swallowed whole, planets left hollow. The knocking wasn't coming for one house, one family, one town. It came for everything, and she had been the door for this place. The world was gone. At first, she hadn't realized it. The fog had thickened so gradually that she didn't notice when the road, the trees, even the stars above, vanished completely. Now there was nothing but grey-white expanse, stretching in all directions, an infinite void humming faintly, with the sound of countless whispers. She stood, not by choice, but because she could no longer feel her legs, her body a hollow puppet, jerked upright by unseen strings. The journal was gone. The crucifix had slipped from her hand, but it didn't matter anymore. Objects had no meaning here. This was not a place for the living. The knocking came louder now, not from outside or within, but from everywhere at once. Tap, tap, tap. The sound rippled through the air like thunder, cracking the ground beneath her feet. Lines spread like veins, glowing faintly red. She looked down and saw faces beneath the cracks, hundreds of them, twisted in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. A figure stepped forward from the fog. It was the same faceless thing that had haunted her under the overpass, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked in an unnatural gesture of curiosity. Behind it, hundreds more shapes emerged, silhouettes without features, some crawling, some walking, all moving in perfect silence, except for the soft, rhythmic tapping of their limbs against unseen surfaces. Tap, tap, tap. They formed a circle around her, pressing close enough that she could feel their cold presence washing over her skin like waves. A single voice rose above the whispers, calm and patient. The doors are open, the invitation accepted, the binding complete. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but her voice was gone, her muscles unresponsive. A sudden vibration shook the ground. From somewhere far below, a sound like stone grinding against stone roared up through the cracks. The faces beneath the ground shifted, their mouths moving in silent unison, as though chanting. The glowing lines pulsed brighter, spreading outward across the grey void. Then, impossibly, a city began to rise around her, its buildings twisting in impossible angles, architecture that defied physics. Towers of bone and stone, reaching high into a sky that wasn't there. Windows blinked like eyes, doors breathed like lungs. This was no place built for humans. It was a reflection of something older, something that had waited eons for a vessel. The voice spoke again, louder now, layered with thousands of tones. We do not come to destroy. We come to reside, to dwell, to inhabit. She felt something shift in her chest. The knocking had become a pounding now, each strike sending a burst of cold fire through her ribs. Tap, tap, tap. She clawed weakly at her shirt, feeling movement beneath her skin. Hands, small cold hands pressed from the inside, as though trying to break free. She staggered and fell to her knees as the circle of figures pressed closer, their whispers building to a deafening chorus. We are home. You are our home. Her tears burned her cheeks as she fought to hold on to herself, to remember who she was before the knocks began. But her memories were crumbling, replaced by alien images, endless doorways, countless worlds, all of them opening, all of them letting them in. In one final surge of desperate clarity, she screamed. The sound tore through the void, raw and primal, shaking the figures back a fraction. For the briefest moment, she felt her own heartbeat again, faint but real. She clung to it, whispering a prayer she barely remembered. But the tallest figure stepped forward and placed a cold, elongated finger against her forehead. The prayer withered in her throat. Her heartbeat faltered. The knocking returned in its place. Tap, tap, tap. The voice spoke one final time, soft and almost tender. You were never meant to be alone. You are open. You are us. And then she felt it, her body melting away like wax, her thoughts unraveling as countless others flooded in. Faces, voices, memories not her own. She was no longer one. She was legion. When the city of bone and stone finally stilled, there was silence, but faintly on every door, in every heart, across every world, 3 soft knocks echoed. Tap, tap, tap. And that's where we'll leave it, for now. But remember, the knocking never really stops. It only waits for the next door, the next whisper of come in. Could it be yours? If you enjoyed this chilling story and want to uncover even more haunting tales, mysteries and forgotten pieces of history that will keep you up at night, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss the next descent into the unknown. Trust us, you don't want to be the last one to hear the knock.